The night was red with fire. The smell of smoke and blood drifted on the desert wind, heavy and choking, filling the little cabin where Ellen hid beneath the bed. She was only 9 years old, her body pressed tight against the dusty floorboards, her hands over her mouth to stifle the trembling sobs. Outside, horses screamed and men shouted, some in a language she did not understand, others in English, broken by terror. Then came the crack of rifles, the thud of hooves, and the terrible silence that followed. When the door of the cabin was flung wide, the sudden flood of firelight blinded her. She dared not move. Through the thin slats of the bed frame, she saw boots moccasins, not the leather boots her father wore. Shadows moved like spirits across the walls. One of the men crouched low, peering into the corners, hunting for survivors. Ellen held her breath until her lungs burned. A hand gripped the bed frame and dragged it back. The world seemed to shatter. She was seized by the arm and pulled into the open, kicking and screaming, her small fists useless against the strength of the warrior who held her. His face was painted with streaks of white and black, his eyes hard as stone. Around them, the cabin was already collapsing, the flames devouring it with greedy hunger. Ellen shrieked for her mother, her father, her brothers, but the only answers were the crackle of fire and the guttural shouts of the raiders. Warrior who held her lifted his tomahawk high. For an instant, Ellen thought she would join her family in death. She shut her eyes, waiting for the blow. But it never came. Instead, another voice called out sharp, commanding. She opened her eyes and saw a tall man step forward. His face was lined with age, his gaze steady and measured. Unlike the others, his war paint was simple, almost solemn, and his weapons were lowered. The men around him gave way with respect as he approached. He spoke in Apache, a tongue Ellen could not yet understand, but his tone carried weight. The warrior with the tomahawk hesitated, then lowered his arm reluctantly. Shoving Ellen toward the newcomer, the tall man crouched before her, bringing himself to her level. He studied her with a gaze that was neither cruel nor pitying, but something in between, a calculation, a choice. Ellen trembled, wiping soot from her eyes, but she met his stare. He did not raise his hand against her. Instead, he lifted her gently, setting her on her feet. With a single gesture, he signaled to the others. The raiders mounted their horses, their war cries fading into the night as they disappeared into the desert's vast shadows. The man who had spared her lingered. He placed a hand on Ellen's shoulder, firm and steady, then turned her toward the horizon where the stars burned cold and bright. She did not understand what he meant, but she followed him, stumbling, her bare feet cut by stones and cactus spines. Behind her, the only world she had ever known smoldered in ashes. They traveled for hours, until the night gave way to a pale dawn. Ellen was exhausted, numb, half dreaming as she was lifted onto the back of a horse. She leaned against the man's chest, the thrum of his heartbeat steady beneath her ear. He did not speak to her, nor she to him, yet in that silence, a strange certainty took root. She was no longer a daughter of settlers. She belonged to whatever fate this man decided for her. Days passed in a blur. She was brought into a camp nestled among red cliffs and juniper trees, where women watched her with wary eyes and children whispered behind their hands. She was fed, clothed, and given a place to sleep by the fire. But always the tall man was near, watching over her. In time, Ellen learned his name, Taza. He was a leader among his people, respected and feared, but with her he was patient. He taught her to ride, to gather roots, to drink from the desert's hidden springs. Though she did not know it then, he had made a choice the night he spared her, to raise her not as a slave or a prisoner, but as a daughter. Still, the past clung to her like smoke. At night, when the fires burned low, she dreamed of her family's screams and the glow of her burning home. She would wake in silence, staring into the embers, the memory etched deep in her bones. And though she came to love the man who saved her, though she would one day call him father, the seed of vengeance, the knowledge of fire and loss remained buried in her heart. Desert had a way of stripping things bare, of grinding down wood, bone, and memory until only what was strongest endured. For Ellen, the first weeks in Taza's camp were a blur of strangeness and survival. The women gave her clothes stitched from deer hide, soft and supple, unlike the scratchy cotton she had worn at the homestead. They fed her stews of mesquite beans and rabbit, corn roasted over open flames, and cactus fruit that stained her lips purple. Though she accepted the food and clothing with gratitude, she felt the stares like arrows at her back. Children whispered "the white girl" when she passed, their voices carrying curiosity and suspicion alike. The older ones avoided her, as though her pale skin carried some unseen curse. But Taza did not let her remain apart. On the second morning, he took her by the hand and led her into the hills beyond the camp. The sun was just climbing, casting the desert in gold, and the air smelled of sagebrush and dust. He walked in silence, his stride steady, and Ellen struggled to keep up. When she stumbled, he lifted her onto his horse without a word. They rode until they reached a stream winding between boulders. Its water sparkling like glass. Taza knelt by the bank, cupping his hands to drink. He motioned for her to do the same. Hesitant, Ellen copied him, the cool water easing the dryness in her throat. Taza watched, then nodded once. No smile, no praise, just a simple acknowledgement. Yet to Ellen, that small gesture carried weight. Every day after, he took her into the desert. He showed her how to read the tracks of deer and jackrabbit, how to tell when a rattlesnake lay coiled beneath a rock. He placed an obsidian knife in her hand and guided her grip until she learned to cut cactus pads without pricking herself. When she failed, he did not scold her. When she succeeded, he did not cheer. Instead, he treated her efforts with the same quiet gravity he gave his own work, as though she were expected to learn because life demanded it, not because she was a child who needed coddling. At first, Ellen ached for the softness her mother once gave her gentle hands smoothing her hair, the sound of lullabies whispered over her bed. Taza's way was different, but slowly she came to see its strength. His silence was not coldness but respect. His lessons were not commands but gifts of survival. The nights were hardest. Lying by the fire, Ellen would sometimes hear a woman in the camp humming to her children. The melody tugged at the wound inside her, reopening the grief she carried. When she cried softly into her blanket, she thought she hid it well. But once, when she awoke, she found a carved wooden figure, a small horse, beside her mat. Taza had left it there without a word. She held it close that night, and for the first time, her dreams were not filled with fire. Over the months, she began to speak the Apache tongue. At first, her words came clumsy and broken, drawing laughter from the children. But Taza encouraged her by using only his language around her. Bit by bit, the words settled on her tongue like stones fitting into a wall. Soon, she could ask for water, answer questions, and even laugh at simple jokes. The day she spoke an entire sentence without hesitation, Taza's lips curved just slightly into what might have been a smile. Seasons shifted. Ellen grew taller, her skin bronzed by the desert sun, her hair darkened with dust and wind. She could ride a horse bareback across the plain, her legs gripping tight as the animal thundered beneath her. She could snare a rabbit, gather yucca roots, and weave baskets under the patient guidance of the women who had once doubted her place. Yet no matter how much she learned, a shadow lingered. When arguments broke out among the warriors, she would catch words Nalihe, stranger, Chizi, lizard skin, a slur for outsiders. Their glances reminded her that she was not wholly one of them. She lived in two worlds but belonged fully to neither. One evening, as the sun bled across the cliffs in shades of crimson and violet, Ellen sat beside Taza watching the light fade. She asked him, in halting Apache, why he had spared her when the others would not. He looked at her for a long time before answering. "The fire took much from you," he said slowly. "If I let it take you too, it would take part of me." She did not entirely understand his meaning then, but the words settled deep in her heart. In time, she would carry them like a shield dot, and so Ellen's life became a weaving of two worlds, the memory of her family's ashes and the growing bond with the man who had saved her. She was not Apache by blood, but she was Apache by choice, shaped by the land, the lessons, and the father who had claimed her beneath a burning sky. By the time Ellen reached her 17th year, the desert had shaped her as surely as the wind carved the cliffs. Her shoulders had broadened from drawing boughs and hauling water, her hands grown calloused but steady. She was no longer the white girl who had once clung to Taza's side, though whispers of her strangeness never fully left. She belonged to the Apache by choice, if not by blood, and in her heart she thought no other home could claim her dot. It was in the summer of her 17th year that she first heard the name Caleb Vance. The stories came on the wind, carried by traders and scouts who passed through distant camps. They spoke of a man whose fury burned hotter than the desert sun, a gunslinger who rode with a black coat and a rifle strapped across his saddle. Wherever his boots touched the ground, death followed. He carried a personal war, and his enemies were always the same. Apache dot at first, Ellen dismissed the tales as the kind of stories white men always told, part truth, part rumor. But the details were too sharp, too consistent. A homestead burned in the valley of the Rio Grande. A hunting band ambushed, their bodies left unburied in the dust. A camp slaughtered by moonlight, their tracks leading to a lone rider who never lingered in one place. The whispers spread through Taza's camp. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Warriors grew restless, eager for vengeance of their own. Ellen listened in silence, translating what she could for herself, but the unease in her chest grew heavier. The name haunted her, and though she had never seen him, she felt the man drawing closer with every tale. One evening, as the sun slid low and painted the cliffs in blood-red light, Ellen sat with Taza by the fire. The camp had eaten in silence that night, the fear of the stories thick in the air. She turned to him, her voice low. "Father," she said, using the Apache word she had come to trust, "there is a man. His vengeance burned. I have heard it in the mouths of the traders. He kills our people without end." Taza's face was carved from stone, his gaze fixed on the fire. "Vance," he said, the name heavy on his tongue. "I have heard it also. Who is he?" Ellen asked. "A white man," Taza replied. "One who believes blood can be answered only with blood." He stirred the embers with a stick, sparks rising like restless spirits. "His brother died in a raid. He blames all Apache for it. He will not stop until the desert itself swallows him." The answer chilled her. She knew too well what fire and grief could make of a man. She had carried her own rage once, a child's helpless fury at losing her family. But where Taza had taught her to bear it, this Caleb Vance had fed his grief until it consumed him. That night, she lay awake listening to the restless murmur of the camp. The people feared raids, but Ellen feared something more. She knew that men like Vance did not stop with one camp or one hunting party. They carried their vengeance like wildfire, spreading wherever there was fuel. And she could feel it, the certainty that his path would lead here, to Taza, to the man who had raised her. Proof came. A runner arrived from a distant band, his body streaked with sweat, his words tumbling in panic. Caleb Vance had struck again. A dozen dead, 2 taken alive only to be left hanging from mesquite trees. The description was the same. A lone rider, his rifle speaking death in the night. Ellen's blood ran cold. She watched Taza listen in silence, his face unreadable. When the runner was done, Taza only nodded and sent him away. Then he turned to Ellen. "You see now," he said. "The fire you spoke of burns close." Ellen met his gaze, her heart thundering. "He will come here." "I know it." Taza placed a hand on her shoulder, heavy but steady. "Then we will be ready." But as the stars wheeled overhead, Ellen lay awake by the fire, her thoughts tangled in fear and memory. For in Caleb Vance's fury, she saw a mirror of her own, what she might have become had Taza not lifted her from the ashes long ago. His vengeance burned, and she knew it would not end until he found them. Summer bled into autumn, and with it came new stories, darker and closer than before. Each week, travelers arrived at distant trading posts with hushed voices and haunted eyes. They spoke of ambushes along river trails, of camps set upon in the night. The name Caleb Vance was always at the center, carried like a curse across the desert wind. Ellen heard the rumors first from a trader who came to barter maize and pelts. His face was drawn tight with fear as he told of a family cut down near the Jornada del Muerto, their wagon burned to the axles. The trader swore it was not Apaches who did it, but a lone rider in a black coat who left an arrow planted in the earth as if to point the blame. Days later, a wounded scout staggered into camp, his arm wrapped in a bloodied cloth. He told of Vance again, this time hunting a small band of Chiricahua, leaving only 2 alive to carry the tale. The man's voice shook as he described the scene, the lifeless bodies, the horses left slaughtered. The deliberate cruelty of it. The Apache camp grew tense, the air heavy with unspoken fear. Mothers drew their children in close, and warriors sharpened blades by firelight. Even the laughter of the young grew rare, smothered beneath the shadow of a man they had not yet seen. Ellen carried the weight of the stories differently than the others. For them, Vance was a faceless enemy, a danger approaching from beyond the horizon. For her, he was a figure she could almost picture, tall, eyes like burning coals, a face twisted by the same grief she herself had once tasted. She thought of him at night, lying awake under the stars, and wondered if he carried the same memories she did of flames, of loss, of screams carried on the wind. One evening, she found herself speaking to Taza as they walked along the stream at the edge of the valley. "He blames your people for what was done to his brother," she said quietly, testing her words in the Apache tongue. "But is he wrong? Were there not raids that took from his family as raids took mine?" Taza did not answer at once. He stooped by the water, washing his hands clean of the dust before rising again. His face was grave, his eyes reflecting the last of the fading sun. "Raids take much," he said finally. "They take fathers, sons, and wives. They have taken from me as well. But vengeance does not give back what was lost. It only feeds the fire until nothing is left but ash." Ellen lowered her gaze. She wanted to believe him, but in her heart she felt the pull of something darker. She had dreamed of vengeance once, as a child trembling in the ruins of her family's cabin. Had Taza not chosen to lift her up, she might have grown into something very much like Caleb Vance. The rumors spread still further. Scouts said Vance was no longer a lone figure. Men had begun to ride with him, drifters and guns for hire drawn by his ruthless certainty. His posse left trails of fire behind them, the work of men who sought no peace. Only blood. Ellen began to feel guilt gnawing at her. She thought of her fair hair, her pale skin, reminders of the world she had been born into. Perhaps Vance would look at her and see not a daughter of Taza, but a woman who belonged with him by right. She could not shake the fear that her very presence might draw him to their camp. One night, as the warriors gathered to speak of what must be done, Ellen stepped forward. Her voice was steady, though her heart pounded. "His vengeance burned," she told them, her words falling into the silence of the circle. "He will not stop until he drinks our blood. You must see this. He is not a man who can be bargained with. He will come here, as the fire always seeks more wood." Her words hung in the air, heavier than she intended. The men shifted, glancing to Taza. He sat in silence for a moment, then nodded once. "She speaks true," he said. "We will prepare." The decision set the camp in motion. Scouts were sent to watch the trails. Horses were tethered close. Weapons were checked and sharpened. Yet even with all the readiness, Ellen felt a hollow dread deep in her chest. For though she had lived as Apache for many years, she could not escape the truth that Caleb Vance belonged to the same bloodline as she did. His fury was her shadow, his vengeance a mirror of what she might have become, and she feared the day he would look into her eyes and see not a stranger, but kin. The day Ellen first saw Caleb Vance was burned into her memory like a brand. She had ridden out at dawn with 2 young hunters to gather mesquite pods in the foothills. The air was cool, the sky washed pale with morning, and for a time it felt almost peaceful. Then, cresting a rise, she spotted a lone rider on the trail below. Even at a distance, there was something unmistakable about him. He sat tall in the saddle, shoulders straight, the brim of his black hat casting his face in shadow. A rifle glinted in its scabbard, the steel catching the sun. His horse, a rangy bay, carried itself with the restless energy of an animal too long on the road. The hunters stiffened, hands drifting toward their weapons. But Ellen's breath caught for another reason. Though she had never seen him before, she knew him instantly. The stories had prepared her, painted him so vividly that recognition came like instinct. This was Caleb Vance, the man of fire. He raised a hand in greeting, not threat. Then his gaze found hers, and even across the distance she felt the weight of it. His eyes were sharp, not with wildness but with something colder, purpose. "Stay back," Ellen told the hunters in Apache. "Do not fire unless he strikes first." They obeyed reluctantly, watching as the man urged his horse closer. When he was near enough to speak, his voice carried clear and steady. "You," he said, pointing to Ellen, "step down. I'll not harm you." Something in the cadence of his words, slow, deliberate, touched with an accent she remembered faintly from childhood, stirred a long-buried memory. She dismounted cautiously, her pulse quick. He studied her, eyes narrowing. "I know that face," he murmured. "By God, I do." Ellen stiffened. "How?" "I rode with your father once," he said. "Years back, before the raids grew worse. He was a stubborn man, proud. You favor him." Her throat went dry. She wanted to deny it, but the truth was plain. Caleb Vance had known her blood. He was part of the world she had left behind in fire. He leaned forward in the saddle. "What are you doing with them?" "These savages? They took your family from you, same as they took my brother from me. You should be with your own kind." Anger flared hot in her chest. "They are my kind," she shot back. "They raised me when I had nothing. They are my family now." His expression hardened, though sorrow flickered beneath it. "You've been twisted, girl. Fed lies until you forgot the truth. But blood speaks louder than any tongue. You're white, like me, and I'll not leave you here to be their pawn." The hunters shifted uneasily, though they did not understand his words. Ellen held up a hand to keep them still. She answered in English, her voice trembling but firm. "You don't know me. You don't know what Taza gave me. You think vengeance is all there is, but you're wrong." Vance's jaw tightened. "You sound like him. I sound like myself." For a moment, silence stretched between them, taut as a drawn bow. Then Vance sighed, shaking his head. "You'll see, child. They can't change what you are. When the fire comes, you'll remember where you belong." He wheeled his horse and rode off, his figure shrinking against the horizon until the desert swallowed him. Ellen stood trembling, her heart in chaos. She had faced raiders, hunger, storms, but never the raw weight of divided blood. Caleb's words had cut deep, stirring a part of her she had thought buried. Was she Apache, forged by Taza's hand, or was she the daughter of settlers, tied by blood to men like Vance. When she returned to camp, she told Taza everything. He listened in silence, his face unreadable. At last he placed his hand on her shoulder. "You are my daughter," he said simply. "What blood says does not matter. What you choose, that is what matters." But Ellen knew the choice would not remain words. Caleb Vance was gathering men, building his fire into something larger. And when it came, she would have to stand before him again, not only as Taza's daughter, but as the child of two worlds, forced to decide which one would claim her soul. The weeks that followed Ellen's encounter with Caleb Vance were heavy with unease, as if the entire camp were holding its breath. Scouts returned with news of riders gathering in distant towns, men of no loyalty but to coin and blood, hired by Vance with promises of plunder. Smoke was sighted on the horizon more than once, the remnants of ranches and way stations put to the torch. The camp began to change. Warriors drilled in the evenings, their chants echoing through the valley. Spears were sharpened, arrows fletched anew. Horses were kept tethered close, restless with the scent of fear in the air. Mothers carried their children nearer the fires, and the laughter that had once rolled through the camp grew scarce. Ellen felt the weight of it most when she looked at Taza. The man who had once been a steady wall against every storm now seemed older, his eyes carrying shadows. Yet his voice did not waver, nor did his resolve. "We will not run," he told his people. "This land is ours. If Vance seeks us, he will find we are ready." But Ellen's heart was less certain. She had seen Caleb's eyes, the way grief and rage had hollowed him out, leaving only fire. He was not a man who would turn aside, nor one easily killed. She feared that to meet him in open battle was to invite the flames into their very heart. At night, she walked the edges of camp, listening to the desert breathe. Sometimes she thought she heard hoofbeats on the wind, but when she turned, there was only silence and shadow. She dreamed of fire again, of the night her family had burned. Only now it was the Apache camp in flames, the screams of children echoing where once her brothers had. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, Ellen sat with Taza outside his wickiup. "Father," she said, her voice low, "there is no shame in moving the people. Vance's fire cannot be quenched, but it can be outpaced." Taza's gaze was fixed on the mountains. "If we run, he will follow. There is no end to vengeance. It is like hunger, it feeds itself." He turned to her, his face calm but firm. "You know this, daughter." "You saw it in his eyes," Ellen swallowed. "Yes, and that is why I fear him." Taza nodded slowly. "Good. Fear makes us careful. But it must not make us blind." The following day, scouts returned with final confirmation. Vance and his men were riding hard, no more than 2 days distant. The camp stirred like a hive. Weapons were passed out. The old and the very young were sent higher into the cliffs under the care of the women. Fires were doused to keep smoke from betraying their position. Every sound, every movement felt sharpened, like the moment before a storm breaks. That night, Ellen lay awake by the embers, listening to the warriors murmur low. She rose before dawn and climbed the ridge above camp. The sky was a pale wash of stars, fading into the first hints of light. From there she could see far across the desert, the land vast and silent. Yet in that silence she felt it, the approach of something relentless. When she descended again, Taza was waiting. He handed her a bow, its grip worn smooth with years of use. "This is yours now," he said simply. She accepted it, her fingers trembling as she wrapped them around the wood. It was not just a weapon. It was a promise. By midday, the scouts returned with word. Vance's posse had been sighted. Dozens of men, armed with rifles and revolvers, their faces hungry for violence. They were riding toward the canyons where Taza's people waited. Ellen stood among the warriors, the bow heavy in her hands. She remembered Caleb's voice. the way he had spoken of blood and belonging, of fire and family. His vengeance burned. Yes, but so too did her love for the people who had raised her as the camp braced for the storm. Ellen knew the choice was already made. When the fire came, she would not run. She would stand with Taza and the Apache. No matter what blood said, and somewhere out there, Caleb Vance was riding closer, his fire drawn to her like a moth to flame. The Apache chose their battleground with care. The canyon was narrow, its walls steep and jagged, carved by centuries of water and wind. From its ridges, an archer could rain death on any who rode below, while hidden paths allowed warriors to strike and vanish like shadows. It was a place that favored patience, cunning, and those who knew the desert's secrets. By dusk, the camp was silent. The elders and children had been led deeper into the cliffs, far from the fighting ground. Only the warriors remained, their faces painted in streaks of white, black, and red, their eyes sharp with resolve. Ellen stood among them, the bow Taza had given her strung tight across her back. Her heart pounded like a drum in her chest, yet her hands were steady. From the ridge above, scouts gave the signal. Dust rose in the distance. The riders were coming. Caleb Vance led them at the front, his black coat billowing, his rifle glinting in the fading light. Behind him rode a ragged band of gunmen, their faces hard with greed, their voices carrying crude laughter that echoed against the stone. They were confident, unaware that every eye in the canyon watched them, every bowstring drawn taut, Ellen's gaze fixed on Vance. Even from afar, she could see the fire in his eyes, the relentless drive of a man who lived only for vengeance. A shiver ran through her, not of fear, but of recognition. The trap was sprung with a war cry that split the twilight. Arrows whistled down from the cliffs, striking horses and men alike. The posse shouted in shock, scrambling for cover that the canyon walls denied them. Some fell, pierced before they could fire a shot. Others dismounted, rifles raised toward the ridges. Gunfire cracked, echoing like thunder. Stones splintered where bullets struck. Ellen loosed her first arrow, her aim guided by years of Taza's teaching. It struck a rider square in the chest, sending him crashing to the ground. She did not pause to think, only knocked another arrow, drew, and fired again. The canyon became a furnace of sound shouts, gunfire, the screams of men and horses. Dust and smoke mingled in the air, stinging Ellen's eyes. Warriors moved like spirits along the ridges, loosing arrows, then vanishing into shadowed paths. The posse fought desperately, but the canyon's walls turned their numbers into chaos. Through it all, Caleb Vance rode forward. Bullets snapped past him, arrows grazed his coat, yet he pressed on, firing his rifle with deadly precision. 3 warriors fell beneath his shots, each placed clean and merciless. His men faltered, but he did not, driven by the fire that consumed him. At the heart of the canyon, Taza stepped forward to meet him. He raised his spear high, his voice cutting through the din. The 2 men's eyes locked across the chaos, one filled with vengeance, the other with the steady weight of survival. Vance dismounted, rifle cast aside, drawing his revolver with a flourish. Taza advanced with spear and knife, the dust swirling around them as if the canyon itself held its breath. Savage. Vance shouted, his voice hoarse with fury. "Your people took my blood. Tonight, I take yours." Taza's reply was calm, almost sorrowful. "The fire has eaten you, white man. You are already ash." They clashed in a fury of steel and gunfire. Vance's revolver roared, the first shot grazing Taza's arm, the second shattering rock inches from his head. Taza lunged, his spear thrusting, forcing Vance back. The 2 circled, striking, dodging. The world narrowed to their duel. From the ridge, Ellen watched, torn between fear and duty. Every instinct screamed to intervene, but something in her heart held her still. This was not hers to finish, not yet. Vance's fire burned bright, but Taza's strength was the desert itself, enduring, unyielding. With a sudden cry, Taza knocked the revolver from Vance's hand, then drove him back against the canyon wall. The knife flashed in his grip, inches from Vance's throat. For the first time, Caleb faltered. Rage burned in his eyes, but beneath it flickered something else, grief, raw and unhealed. The battle raged on around them, but in that moment, the canyon seemed to hold only the two men, locked in a struggle older than either of them. Vengeance against endurance, fire against stone. And Ellen, bow trembling in her hands, knew that whichever way the duel ended, the fire that Caleb Vance carried had already changed her life forever. The canyon was a furnace of smoke and echoes, the cries of men and the clash of steel rolling between the stone walls. Ellen crouched on the ridge, her bow drawn, her eyes fixed not on the chaos around her but on the two figures at the canyon's heart, Taza and Caleb Vance. The Apache chief and the gunslinger moved like shadows locked in orbit. Taza's spear sweeping in arcs, Vance lunging with knife and empty rage. Every strike rang with years of grief. Dust rose around them, clinging to sweat and blood, the air hot with the smell of gunpowder. Ellen's heart pounded as though it would break her ribs. She wanted to cry out, to leap down, to stop it, but she knew that this was a fire neither of them would let another quench. Vance struck first, driving his knife across Taza's arm, opening a red gash. Taza grunted but did not falter. He countered, the haft of his spear slamming into Vance's chest, staggering him back against the canyon wall. For a heartbeat, the gunslinger faltered. His revolver lay forgotten in the dust. His coat was torn, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. Yet his eyes still burned, fierce and unbroken. "Kill me," Vance roared, voice raw. "Kill me, savage, and prove me right." Taza's spear hovered inches from his throat. His chest rose and fell, his breath harsh, but his gaze remained steady. "No," he said, voice like stone. "Your fire dies here, not in my hands, but in your own." With a sudden surge, Vance wrenched free and drove forward. The knife slashed, desperate, wild. Taza twisted, but not quickly enough. The blade sank deep into his side. Ellen gasped, rising to her feet, her bow trembling in her grip. Before she could loose her arrow, Taza struck back. His spearhead thrust forward, straight through Caleb Vance's chest. The gunslinger froze, eyes wide with shock. His knife clattered from his hand. For a moment he swayed, still glaring at Taza. Then his knees gave way. The canyon seemed to fall silent as he crumpled to the dust. All around, the battle faltered. The hired men, seeing their leader fall, broke. Some fled on horseback, others threw down their rifles and begged for mercy. The Apache warriors pressed them back, driving them from the canyon. Smoke and dust cleared slowly, leaving behind the broken bodies of the dead, the groans of the wounded. Ellen scrambled down the ridge, her heart thundering. She dropped to her knees beside Taza, who leaned heavily on his spear, his face pale. Blood soaked his side, but his eyes still held their calm strength. "You fought like the desert itself," she whispered. Clutching his arm, he laid a hand on her shoulder, his grip weak but steady. "And you?" "Stood like my daughter." Tears blurred her vision. "You are my father." "By blood or not, you are." He managed the faintest smile, then looked past her to where Caleb Vance lay. The gunslinger's breath came shallow, his fire finally guttering. Ellen rose and went to him, kneeling by his side. His eyes found hers, and for a moment she saw not the man of fire but a weary soul, emptied of all but grief. "You should have been with us," he rasped out. Ellen shook her head, tears streaking her cheeks. "No, I am where I belong." A bitter smile ghosted his lips. "Then," Maybe you were the lucky one. His eyes closed, his chest stilled, and the fire that had driven him so long burned out at last. The canyon was quiet now. Smoke drifted upward, carrying with it the scent of blood and ashes. Ellen stood between the two men who had shaped her life, one by sparing her, one by threatening to claim her. Taza, wounded but alive. Vance, consumed by his own fury. She looked to the sky, the stars beginning to pierce the dusk, and whispered words meant for neither man but for the desert itself. His vengeance burned, but love endured. The survivors gathered their dead, the women and children returning from the cliffs. Songs rose into the night, mourning and defiance mingled together. Ellen sat by Taza's side, binding his wound as best she could, her hands steady despite the weight in her chest. The fire of vengeance had passed, leaving only ashes. But in those ashes, Ellen knew a different fire remained, one not of destruction, but of endurance, a family chosen rather than given. And as dawn came to the canyon, painting the stone walls in gold, she vowed that this fire she would carry forward, for Taza, for herself, and for the people who had become her own.